Father, thank you for just your heart after us and how you have shown us your amazing heart in your relationship to Israel. And so these are critical days in which we are now living. And I pray, God, that you would open our eyes and our heart to what you would show us tonight through this class. We ask that in Jesus' name, amen. Well, I do this class every year and have been for a number of years, and I find it very, very important and seemingly more important every year because of the way things are happening in the world today. I'm convinced that we are living in those days that are drawing nearer and nearer to the latter days. And many of you know my stance in regards to Israel in prophecy, that when you look at the word of prophecy in the scriptures, that the center of the fulfilling of biblical prophecy will be Israel. So in other words, you want to pay very close attention to what is happening in Israel regarding the fulfilling of prophecy in the latter days. The very center of that will be Jerusalem, and the epicenter of that will be the Temple Mount. We're going to talk about that this evening as well. But the theme of the class is the history of the modern Palestinian problem. So we want to look mostly at the modern history of Israel, particularly how did we get here in the Middle East, focusing on the question of the Palestinian problem. When I mean the Palestinian problem, I'm speaking of the Palestinian refugees. Now, you might know that this is a major point of focus and contention and disagreement and conflict around the world, of course. And it's very, very important in regards to what's happening in the Middle East, and the relationships of the world to Israel are very, very important. And I have a tremendous heart for Israel. I believe that the scripture that says, those who bless Israel will be blessed, I believe is very much true still to this day, and should also inform our foreign policy as a nation. We ought to, as a nation, stand with Israel for not only political reasons, but for biblical reasons, because those who bless Israel will be blessed. And of course, politically, they are our greatest ally in the Middle East, and they certainly stand for democracy and the rule of law, and so we find a tremendous powerful ally in Israel in the Middle East. So there's political reasons, but more than that, there's biblical reasons. Those who bless Israel will be blessed. And so we want to talk about the history of the modern Palestinian problem, but in order to do that, we do need to run through history briefly. So I'm going to do a very, very fast summary of the history of Israel, beginning with the time of Jesus, where he made the prophetic word that the city would be destroyed, that the temple would be destroyed, and not one stone left upon another. And this was fulfilled exactly as Jesus said in 66 AD when Israel revolted against Rome. Many of you, of course, know your history. So that culminated, of course, in the destruction of Israel and the overthrow of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple. Now, what's interesting is that about 50 years later or so, another Jewish revolt occurred. And this was put down by the emperor, of course, who decided then to expel Jews from Jerusalem, to rename the city. And so the city of Jerusalem was renamed Capitolina. And the whole of the area was renamed. What was formerly called Israel was renamed after the enemies, the well-known enemies of Israel, the Philistines. So it was renamed Palestine, the mortal enemy of Israel. Why was it renamed Palestine? so as to offend the Jews. Now, this is very important because today, many of the Arabs or Palestinians, when we hear the word Palestinian today, many people are confused what that name even means. A Palestinian, that is not an ethnic background. Instead, it is a name or a word used to describe the area. So it is the area of Palestine. Palestinians are, in fact, Arabs. So it's very important, of course. You know that Arabs and the Jews have a long history as well, which goes all the way back to Abraham. Many of you know this. Also, that God promised Abraham a son through whom all the promises would be fulfilled. Abraham was quite old. As you know, his wife was very old, beyond the age of childbearing. And so rather than believe God for a miracle, Sarah, his wife, suggested that Abraham could take her handmaiden Hagar and to have a son, which actually was a fairly common practice. But it certainly was not done of faith. And the idea, I don't want to get into this too long because this class is only one evening, and I feel pressed to do it all in one evening. We need a whole series to do it well. But nevertheless, it was common in those days for a handmaiden to a woman who was barren and had money, that the husband would bear a child through the handmaiden. And if the handmaiden would bear the child on the knees of the woman, then she would have the baby. The baby would be hers. And this was the idea that Sarah had. And so the boy that was born was Ishmael. And so Ishmael was not the son whom God had promised, of course. And so God came later and said, no, Sarah will have a boy, and he will be called Isaac. And there's a lot to that, and it's tremendous. That is the boy, that is the son of promise. But nevertheless, a word about Ishmael was given, a prophetic word, that these two would be at enmity and animosity, and he would be a wild donkey of a man. And so all of the Arab nations today find and can trace their lineage all the way back to Abraham, through Hagar, through Ishmael. Very important. So in reality, the Arabs and the Jews are related. You got to go back a long way, but they're related. And of course, many of you have heard that the three largest religions in the world, Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, all trace their roots back to Abraham. And that's the explanation for that. We trace our roots to Abraham, who is the father of faith. And so does, of course, Israel. And now you know, of course, so do the Arabs. So the Arabs that are living in that land today are Palestinian Arabs. So the name Palestine comes from when the Roman government renamed it. This was something around like about 125 AD or so, as again to offend the Jews. So modern Palestinians are not Philistines of old. And it's an interesting thing. There's actually a modern thing today of trying to kind of recreate history, rewriting history for their own purposes. It's very important that we understand history and understand it rightly, and that's why this class is so important. Today, there is a rising anti-Semitism in the world, and this is very, very concerning. A rising anti-Semitism in the world today, and there is a rising pro-Palestinian Arab sentiment arising today. You could go to university campuses all over this country, and I think you would be shocked, and maybe you wouldn't be shocked, but in fact, it is shocking how many of the modern contemporary university students are pro-Palestinian. And I can almost assure you that there is a tremendous lack of understanding of the history, of the modern history of what is happening in the Middle East today. So back to our sketch through time. So Israel was renamed Palestine, as again to offend the Jews, and was renamed Capitolina. And on the Temple Mount was built a temple to Jupiter. You might not know this, but a temple to Jupiter was built on the Temple Mount. This was as offensive as you can be. Then roll forward a little bit. As you know, the Roman Empire was divided east and west. And the east was centered on Constantinople. And finally, of course, Constantine, the emperor, became a Christian. And the whole of the Roman Empire became Christian, which is pretty amazing, really. And so Jerusalem became a Christian city. And there was a tremendous anti-Jewish sentiment even amongst the Christians. And so many of the Jews were expelled, not just from Jerusalem, but from Israel. And so then, of course, as you know, the Western Roman Empire fell. And so only thing that remained was the Eastern Roman Empire, which became known as the Byzantine Empire. Some of you remember this from history class. The Byzantine Empire ruled that area for quite some time from what was known as Constantinople. Now you roll the tape forward until about the 600s, and then the rise of Muhammad and Islam. So according to Muhammad tradition, or Islamic tradition, Muhammad flew to the Temple Mount and back on that fateful night in 620 AD. And so it is considered to be the farthest mosque at the time. And so it became a holy point, a holy place in Islamic understanding. So that's important today. And so Islam then took power and ruled the area for several hundred years. And then arose the Crusades. This is a pretty fast sketch through history, you'll have to admit. The Crusades arose for the point that the holy sites in Israel were controlled by Islam, by Muslims. And so there was a rising desire to take it back, take back all the holy sites. And so the Pope particularly made a call for arms and for volunteers to go. And the first crusade was about 1095 AD or so. And they reclaimed the Holy Land, reclaimed Israel. Now, along the way, by the way, it's important to note that there was a tremendous anti-Jewish sentiment amongst Christians during the Middle and Dark Ages. Now, that's important to recognize. Anti-Semitism has a lot to do with where we're going with the history of Israel in this class. Now, why was there such anti-Jewish sentiment? Now, today, at the earlier comments I made, I said that we stand with Israel, that those who bless Israel will be blessed. It's part of my theology. It's part of my stance in the church. Well, why then, as we look through some of the history of the church, do we find that the church was anti-Semitic against Israel? Why? And I suggest to you that it had a lot to do with a lack of education. And one of the main reasons that the church was against Jews was that they blamed Israel for the crucifixion of Jesus Christ. And thereby, there were many tremendous efforts at retribution, getting after the Jews because they crucified the Lord Jesus Christ. Now, I'm sorry, but that's very wrongful theology. No one takes my life from me, Jesus said. I lay it down on my own accord, and I can take it up again. Jesus spoke, of course, of his resurrection. I am the resurrection and the life. And so it's very important that the crucifixion of Jesus Christ was in fact the purpose of God. You can go all the way back to to Genesis, all the way through Revelation, and you can see that it has been in the purpose of God from the very beginning. The redemption story of God is found in Jesus Christ through the crucifixion. It was the very purpose of God that he would pay the penalty for all of our sin. If Jesus wasn't crucified, we would still be in our sins. and there would be no resurrection for our sins, and so for the redemption of life. And so actually the blaming of the Jews is incorrect. We're all to blame because he died for our sins. It was the very purpose of God to redeem as payment for our sins. That's why Jesus died on the cross. And so anti-Semitism is very wrongly placed. But again, I believe in the Dark Ages, there was a tremendous lack of education. And so then the Jews began to be blamed for many things, particularly during the Middle Ages, Dark Ages. For example, the Black Plague. Many Jews were blamed for the Black Plague. Why? Why would that be? Because the Black Plague did not impact the Jews like it did others. The Jewish communities, as you know, many of you know, that they stayed in communities, very tight-knit communities. And the Black Plague did not impact the Jewish communities. Why? Well, because, of course, we have come to understand that it was spread through rats, the fleas on rats. And rats are unclean, you probably know. And so Jews would not have rats in their communities. That is an unthinkable, unclean thing to have rats in the community. And so there were no rats, and therefore there was no Black Plague. And then the people started thinking, what is this? Look, you see, the Jews are not impacted by the Black Plague. We are. They must be the cause of it. They're poisoning our wells, or they're doing thus and so. And so again, a lack of knowledge, a tremendous lack of knowledge was behind that. And then rumors. Many rumors began to spread, false rumors, such as that they accused the Jews of kidnapping children and killing them, taking their blood and mixing it with their Passover meals. Which you might know, like that is about as offensive as you can be. A Jew would never eat blood. That is strictly forbidden in the Jewish law. And so again, another false accusation, and the rising of anti-Semitism was a real concern. And it was part of the Crusades as well. And then, of course, as you know, the Crusades lasted about, I believe, 300-400 years. And then they were cast off. There was an arising of power through Egypt, and then finally the Turks. And so the Turks controlled that area, and this is very important. I'm leading right now up to the modern times when I bring up the Turks. They ruled that area for 400 years, from about 1516 to 1917. And that would be called the Ottoman Empire. Many of you remember reading that, or at least hearing references to the Ottoman Empire. Now, this is very important because the Ottoman Empire was very, very powerful when they first took the area and controlled the whole of the area in 1516, and became very powerful for next 200-300 years. But toward the end of their power, they began to become, let's say, financially in trouble. And so they were not nearly as strong, but they controlled that area. That area known as Palestine was controlled by the Ottomans. By the way, the Ottomans, the Turks, are not Arabs. No, they're Turks. They're from the land above. They're not Arabs. This is very important. Please keep this in mind, because when the Palestinian Arabs make claim to the land, we have to ask the question, when exactly did those Arabs control that land? They would have to go all the way back to the 600s. But Israel, of course, had that land for thousands of years before that. So during the 1600 to 1970, the Ottoman Empire controlled that area. The Arabs did not. This is very important. The Arabs did not. I mentioned the rising of anti-Semitism in Europe during that period of time. And so around, let's bring our time clock to about late 1800s. With the rising anti-Semitism that was in Europe, in Eastern Europe, many Jews started having a thought. We should think about a Jewish homeland. And so the idea of a homeland started arising in Jews around the world. And some Jews started to migrate to Israel. By the way, a Jew that migrates to that area is back to that land of their forefathers, they are doing a process called Aliyah. That's very important. A Jew going back to their homeland is making Aliyah. They're going home. And so many Jews started making Aliyah out of Russia, for example, where there was a rising anti-Semitism there. And then later on in Europe, more started coming. And then they formed, this is important also, that many Jews around the world formed what was called the Zionist Congress. These are Jews from around the world, had ideas in their mind. Wouldn't it be amazing if we could have a homeland? Because the Jews are unique people. Never in the history of the world, never in the history of the world has it been that a people have been displaced from a homeland for such a time, a long period of time, and then returned to that homeland. It's never happened in the history of the world. And I suggest to you that there is prophetic fulfillment in the return of Israel to their homeland, which we could get into in regards to a class on prophecy. But the Zionist Congress took place, I think, every year in Switzerland, and started by a man named Theodor Herzl, who had written a book called The Jewish State in Germany. And so he invited Jews from around the world to come to this Zionist Congress. If they were Jews, they could come and they could pay a shekel apiece, and which is a Jewish form of money. And they could have a vote in the proceedings of this Zionist Congress, which would convene every year. And it grew more and more effectual with each passing year. And Theodor Herzl. But about the same time, by the way, the Hebrew language also came back. You know, it was dead for many, many years. The Hebrew language was not in use. And so it was reestablished, and newspapers were written in Hebrew for the first time in many, many years, and Hebrew was starting to be spoke again. And so there was a rising sentiment of a Jewish homeland. And of course, the Zionist Congress started to think, where could we have a Jewish homeland? Of course, the dream would be to have a homeland in Israel itself. That would be the dream of dreams. But they also realized that it was controlled by the Turks, the Ottomans, and that was an unlikely scenario. So they thought of all kinds of other ideas. You might not know this, but they thought even of Oregon. This is an actual, you can look it up, it's in the history books. Oregon, because it was not a state at the time, it was still open territory. There was still land available, in other words. And so that was considered a possibility in the 1800s. And Arkansas was considered. Okay, I can make many jokes, but I will not do it. And that's my family's from Arkansas. Uganda was offered to them by England. England controlled Uganda. And England was trying to curry the favor of the Jews during this time. And so Uganda was offered, but that also was resoundingly dismissed. Some representatives from the Zionist Congress met with some of the officials of the Ottoman Empire, suggesting it was a bold move, but they suggested that they could secure vast Jewish loans to help out the troubled Ottoman Empire. And the Ottoman Empire didn't believe that they could do it, but they certainly entertained the idea. But then they realized that this would create so much animosity with the Arabs that they declined. And so nothing came of it. But Jews are moving now. In the late 1800s, early 1900s, Jews are moving back. That brings us to World War I. And in World War I, at the end of that war, 1917, the British defeated the Ottomans. So now the Ottoman Empire is no more, and the British control the area. And so the British went to what was known at the time as the League of Nations. It was the precursor to the United Nations. There was no United Nations at the time. But they went to the League of Nations and they asked for a mandate, authority, basically, to rule over that area. And so it was famously called the British Mandate. So that's very important to remember, British Mandate. The United States, you might know, is not part of the League of Nations. And so the United States made a separate agreement with Britain that they would have authority over the land, which included all of what we would call today Israel, as well as the Jordan area on the other side of the Jordan River, modern day Jordan. They controlled all of that. So 1917, now the British Mandate begins. About the same time also, a famous letter was written by Lord Balfour, who was, I believe, in charge of foreign policy for England. He wrote a letter to Lord Rothschild. You might remember the Rothschild, wealthy, one of the wealthiest families in the world were the Rothschilds. Anybody remember or hearing about the Rothschilds? Well, okay, small diversion. This will be very short. But the Rothschild story is fascinating in its own right. So the father of the Rothschilds was a Jew. These were Jewish people. And he was a coin collector, but also he dealt in money. Now, I say that because it was very common in the time. Money was considered dirty, mostly because it was. Right? We, in our country, for example, if a bill gets dirty, it's taken out of circulation. If a bank finds a bill and it's got too much dirt on it, they take it out and they destroy it. And but not so during this time. Money was literally dirty, and so it was something that was considered beneath a man of stature. It was dirty to handle money. And so the Jews would be willing to handle the money, and they became famous for loaning money. So the Rothschild became friends with the king. I think, I'm trying to remember now. I'm going from memory here, so bear with me if I make a little mistake. But I think it was the king of Bavaria. And he became friends with the king, and became a money lender and handled all of the affairs, the financial affairs of the king, and became very wealthy himself, although he was not very wealthy before that, became vastly wealthy in these dealings. And then he had many sons. I think he had like 5 sons. And then when his sons grew up, he positioned his sons in the great cities of Europe: Amsterdam, London, Paris, Rome, etc. And then they had a whole group of pigeons that became carrier pigeons to relay messages between them. And the first international banking organization seen in the world was done by the Rothschild family. And they would carry these messages by pigeon so that they had information before anyone else did. And they took great advantage of it financially. And they became so vastly wealthy that they would loan money to nations. And there were many nations who needed to borrow money for the purpose of war. And so the Rothschild family became very, very wealthy, very influential. So Lord Balfour in England wrote a letter, famous letter called the Balfour Declaration, to Lord Rothschild, declaring the British supported the idea of the Jews having a homeland in Palestine. And of course, it was celebrated by Jews around the world, and it became a rallying cry for Zionism, to have a home in Israel again. So now the British control the area, British Mandate, and so now waves of Jews, tens of thousands of Jews are coming into Israel. What the Arabs are seeing before them is disconcerting. And so there's an Arab resistance and an Arab uprising to this. Tensions are rising you can imagine now. By the way, the Jews that would come in, they would form these little communities called the kibbutz, a Jewish community, a little farming, communal living arrangement, a kibbutz. Many of you have heard of kibbutz, right? A kibbutz. Multiples would be a kibbutzim. The plural in Hebrew is often an I-am at the end of something. Kibbutzim. Many of these kibbutz established around, and they would, the Zionist Congress started raising money. So their idea was, if we can't have the homeland, we'll buy it. 1 acre at a time. And so they started raising money all around the world. Jews in the United States, there was a tremendous immigration of Jews to the United States from Russia, particularly, of course, during the anti-Semitism of Russia. Many of them moved to the United States, became very wealthy. And so there was a lot of Jewish donations around the world so that they could begin to buy. They would buy, for example, you can buy a swamp pretty cheap in Israel, you know. And back in those days, you could buy a swamp pretty cheap because the Arabs didn't want them. And so they would buy a swamp. Then they would drain the swamp. And if you drain the swamp, you now have a very lush area by which you can grow a tremendous amount of things. And so the productivity of the land was vast. Up to that point, there really was not much productivity in that land. And in fact, famously, I believe Mark Twain visited the area of Palestine and wrote later, it was a barren wasteland. This is before, of course, the Jewish development of the land. This is a barren wasteland. What tremendous opportunity is here, but nothing is being done with it. And that was an interesting observation by Mark Twain. But now the Jews are coming, making aliyah, tens of thousands, buying communities or buying land, building communities. The kibbutzim are growing. They're finding great successes. And interestingly, would hire Arabs to work the land. And so the Arabs, many of them were fine with this arrangement because they were making money. But many of the Arab leaders were saying, this is not a good arrangement. This is not going to end well for the Arabs. So a rising conflict started. So that brings us now closer to World War II. Now, you know, the years leading up to World War II were tremendously anti-Semitic, which of course is the whole point of World War II, was Nazism. And the final solution to what? Have you ever asked yourself that question? The final solution, the Nazis suggested they had the final solution to what? The final solution to the Jewish question. What do we do with these Jews? Because that question was being asked all over Europe. What do we do with these Jews? Because of the anti-Semitic mentality that was arising all over, blaming, again, Jews for so many things. And in Italy, they put Jews in restricted communities, which they called ghettos. The word ghetto comes from the restricted Jewish communities. They could not, they had restricted hours. The Jews had restricted jobs. There were certain jobs they could not have. And this became true all over Europe in many places. There were many jobs that you could not have. They must live in certain communities. It was tremendously harsh. This is leading up to World War II, where, as we know, 6 million Jews died in the Holocaust. Meanwhile, leading up to this, the British have their hands full with this British mandate over Palestine and the conflicts that are rising between the Jews and the Arabs. And so they suggested a variety of things. The Jews at one point suggested that they would do a great division of the land. We need 2 separate states, one for Israel, one for the Arabs, and a grand plan to divide the land between them. This was soundly rejected by the Arabs. There was little support by the Jews, so that was rejected. Then there was another commission that decided, well, what we need to do is to break up the land into smaller little pockets of communities. And this was a little more acceptable to the Jews, but completely rejected by the Arabs. This was not working. And so then the British started to restrict immigration because of the rising Arab sentiment against all of this aliyah. Now by the hundreds of thousands have come. And so now they're restricting the immigration, aliyah. And so many of them, of course, start to do it illegally, trying to break through. And then during World War II, the Jews suggested, let's bring all the Jews together and fight Germany. And England would have nothing to do with that. And they said, the only way that we're going to have an army out of Palestine is if we have an equal number of Arabs fighting also. Well, the Arabs said, no way, we're not going to fight against Hitler. Hitler is annihilating our enemy. And so, in fact, the Arab nations were for Nazi Germany during World War II, as a matter of fact. And many Jews were being expelled from Arab lands. Many found themselves homeless, not being allowed to come. So at the end of World War II, British still controlled the area. But now the Jews are seeing that the British control is actually not working. So they began to resist. They began to resist the British. And finally, the British had all they could take. And they said to the United Nations, which had now been formed, they said to the United Nations, we cannot solve this problem. We hand it to you. And they gave them a deadline. On May 15th, 1948, we are leaving. And if you do not have a solution to the United Nations, if you do not have a solution by May 15th, 1948, we are out and we will let this area turn into utter chaos. You have till May 15th to figure it out. So the United Nations took it up. They debated greatly, as you can imagine. They came up with a solution. This is very important. The United Nations came up with a solution. They decided that the answer was to divide the area into a two-state solution. The Arab state, the Palestinian Arab state, and the Jewish state of Israel. That was the United Nations resolution, which came up for a vote, and it passed 30-13, if I believe correctly. And so based upon that approval by the United Nations, although they did nothing to implement it, they voted to approve it, with a deadline looming, then on May 14th, in the evening, David Ben-Gurion, famous leader of Israel at the time, went onto the radio, announced to the world that Israel was now accepting the terms of the United Nations and declared themselves to be a national state. May 14th, 1948, a day that lives well in history. Now, the president at the time of the United States was President Harry Truman. And Harry Truman was a Christian. And he had pro-Israel sentiments. And so he told his staff, because he expected such a thing to be done, he told his staff, the moment that Israel makes that declaration, alert me, no matter what time of the day or night, so that I might be the first to recognize Israel as a nation. And so his staff will come up something like 5 o'clock in the morning or 4 in the morning, whatever time, super early. And they woke him up and he quickly got dressed, went down and made the official declaration. It had to be ratified by the Congress, but he made the declaration that the United States would stand with Israel and accept and recognize them as a state. Now, would you like to know who the second nation was? The Soviet Union. they voted to approve the partition plan, and they voted to recognize Israel. And they wanted to be the first also. So interesting. Interestingly, the Soviets believed that Israel would be socialist. If they formed a nation, that they would be socialist in nature. Because many of the kibbutzim were essentially socialist in nature. Because there was no ownership. The whole of the community owned all of it. It was a really an idyllic sense of socialism. But no, Israel, when they became a nation, chose democracy, as we, of course, famously know today. So now, the moment that they declared themselves to be a nation, May 14th, 1948, the Arab nations around them, Egypt, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, and Iraq, 5 Arab nations, and the fighting Palestinian Arabs, 6 fighting forces, all declared war on the same day. So now Israel is not even 1 day old, finds themselves facing an enemy of 6 armies, 5 national armies, and then the militias of the Palestine Arabs. No one in the world thought that Israel would survive this. And there was a policy around the world not to supply arms to Israel, including the United States. Because though Truman was pro-Israel, there were many in America that were not. And America was tired of war, and they did not want to provide arms for Israel. And so no one thought they could survive this. How is it possible? So therefore, that brings us to the modern Palestinian problem, the modern Palestinian refugee problem. How did they arise? It brings us to this moment in history. This is really where the Palestinian refugee problem arose. Now, with the conflict arising, it was known by the Arabs in advance that if Israel makes this declaration, that they would declare war. Now, let me sidestep myself for 1 second and just change topics for 1/2 a second. What would have happened if Israel declared themselves to be a state on May 14th, 1948, accepting the terms of the United Nations, and the Palestinian Arabs also declared the same time? If they would have said at the very same time, we also accept the terms of the United Nations, and we also declare ourselves to be a state. By the way, that partition plan the United Nations came up with gave the vast majority of the land to the Arabs. The Jews were given a very small minority of the land. They were given the area on the west side of the Sea of Galilee. They were given the strip of land along the coast, and they were given the desert south of Israel. That was what they were given. But Israel said, better is a little than none at all. We accept. At least we have a homeland. This was something that they had only dreamed of 50 years before. And so what would have happened? Now, this is a very important question. Please keep this question in your mind. What would have happened if the Arabs, Palestinian Arabs, would have accepted the terms set forth by the United Nations in that resolution in 1948? What would have been the result of that? The result of that, we would have today a 2-state solution. And we would not be debating the refugee crisis that happened in Israel at the time. But the Arabs refused because they believed that all of it should be theirs. They would not concede 1 acre to Israel. It was their plan to bring these Arab nations together, the armies of these nations, and to completely annihilate the remaining Jews. And by the way, it was Hitler's desire to send Rommel's forces through North Africa and invade Palestine and to complete the final solution. He had already killed, he was in the process of killing 6 million Jews. Hitler had sent Rommel with German forces to race across Africa, to invade Palestine and to bring about the final end to the Jews. And as we know, of course, the United States intervention into World War II interceded in North Africa and stopped the Rommel forces, which saved that they were preparing for their last stand. And by the way, many people have asked, why has Israel succeeded? Since 1948, you know, they have won every single war. And some have asked, how is this possible that they could win every single war? Israel's answer, their answer is, we have no choice. It's win or annihilation. There is no other choice. We will be annihilated if we lose. And so we're fighting for our lives. So May 14th, 1948, they make this declaration. So back to the Palestinian refugee problem. Many, of course, could see this conflict and expected it. Therefore, many of the Palestinian Arabs who had the means removed themselves from the arena of battle. Now, this is important because I'm going to give you now 3 reasons, 3 main causes of the Palestinian Arab exodus from that area. So what had happened was the Arabs declared war. And so those Arabs who had the means removed themselves. They did not want to be in the area of the fighting. They believed that they could remove themselves for a few months because they fully expected that Israel would lose and that all of these Arab nations would defeat Israel, and only in a matter of months they could move back into their place and even take the land of their neighbors, the Jews. So many removed themselves. Then many of the Palestinian Arab leaders sent word to Palestinian Arabs living in the fighting arenas, we do not want you as collateral damage. Remove yourself before our armies invade so that we minimize the amount of collateral damage. And once we defeat them, which will not take long, then you can come back and have your land. So hundreds of thousands of Palestinian Arabs fled the areas around the coastline where many of the Jewish communities were, up in the north around Galilee where many Jewish communities were. But many of the Arab communities, they fled the arena of battle so that they would not become casualties, according to the request of the Arab military leaders. That's the second cause. The third cause was Israel themselves. So when Israel would come to an Arab village, now, of course, the war is on. 5 Arab nations have declared war. All of the Palestinian Arabs also are taking up arms. This war is now on. Nobody in their minds thought Israel could survive. But Israel fought with their lives, fought for their lives, for their very survival, and began to not only be able to withstand, but began to actually move forward. And so when they moved forward, they would come to an Arab village. Now, when that Arab village could see that they were going to fall, many believed that if they fell into the hands of the Jews, that the Jews would annihilate them. Why would they think such a thing? Because that's the very thing they intended to do to them. So they thought, this is exactly what will happen to us. They were very wrong. Israel had no intention of doing such a thing. And in fact, the Jews would send a word in advance. They would send a representative in advance to an Arab village. And they would say this to the Arab village: we invite you to stay. You are more than welcome to stay. We wish that you would stay. and be part of this new nation. But if you will not stay, in other words, if you will take up arms against us, we will defeat you. But if you will not take up arms and live with us at peace, then you are welcome to become citizens of the nation of Israel. So the Arab leaders of each village had to decide. Some fled, fearing annihilation, wrongfully. Others said, we accept your terms. We live with you in peace. Let us know when we can get a Jewish passport. Others said, no, we will fight. So then the Jews said, we gave you the opportunity, you chose to fight, you will be defeated and you will be expelled, because we will not have enemies within our borders. And so the third reason is that very thing. Did the Jews expel some of the Palestinian Arabs? Yes, they did. On those terms. We offer you terms of peace. If you will not accept those terms of peace and you insist on fighting, we will defeat you and we will expel you, because we will not have enemies within our borders. The third reason. Out of that, there were something like 500 to 700,000 refugees that moved into areas, Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, the West Bank, Gaza, and the South. 500 to 700 refugees. By the way, back to the war itself, no one in their right mind thought that they could win, but they did. Why? I suggest that there are three reasons why Israel won that war. I'll start with the spiritual. Because God, I believe, has a purpose for Israel in the fulfilling of prophecy, number one. Number two, God's promises to Israel never fail. I believe that when he made everlasting promises to Israel, that they are in fact everlasting promises. And that in the end, when Jesus returns at the end of the age, they will look upon him and they will mourn for him. When the Messiah of Israel, who we know his name is Jesus, Yeshua. When Yehoshua, Jesus, returns, he will set foot in Jerusalem. They will look on him, it says, whom they have pierced. And they will mourn for him like one would mourn for an only child. Why would they mourn for him? Because it was him all those years before. And we missed it. We crucified our Messiah. It was him whom they have pierced, and they will mourn. But it says in that same Zechariah chapter that he will pour out upon them a spirit of grace and a spirit of supplication. That is our Lord, who pours out grace upon them, and thus all Israel will be saved. But that's now I'm delving into prophecy. That's a whole nother topic. So how did Israel not only survive, but win that war? Number one, I say the prophetic fulfillment of God. Secondly, now that the British mandate is over and the British restrictions on immigration are no more. In fact, they had a naval blockade. The British had a naval blockade. Jews escaping out of Nazi Germany were not allowed to enter into Israel, but were held in internment camps, many in Cyprus. And it became a tragedy, a blight on history. That one tragedy was added to another tragedy. Nevertheless, now that the British mandate has been removed, now the naval blockade is lifted, and now there is no restriction to waves and waves of people, Jews coming to make Aliyah, to come live in their homeland. Well, there were more than 1 million Jews fighting in the forces, in the Allied forces. There were 200,000 Jews that died in the forces, in the fighting. Many of them fighting for the Soviets. But now you have the return of hundreds of thousands of experienced military fighters coming tens of thousands a month, swelling the ranks of the Israeli army every month. But we have another problem. They don't have any, they have no weapons. No one would supply them. How are they going to fight with no weapons, no ammunition? There was one nation, and one nation only in the world, that agreed to supply Israel with arms. And that nation? Czechoslovakia. Now, you say, what? Why would Czechoslovakia be the one nation? Their answer, because we know what it's like to be on the victim side of oppression and to be attacked mercilessly without weapons. And so they became those who supplied. Interestingly, side note, I was on a plane one time speaking to a Jew, and I was flying to Israel, and I happened to sit next to this Jewish fellow. He's asking me, what am I doing, you know, and I'm taking a trip, I'm leading people, you know, and so he's fascinated by this, right? And so we get into a conversation, you know, why, you know, do you stand with Israel so, you know, strongly? And I'm telling him, of course, my heart, the scriptures behind that. And of course, you know, Christians haven't always been pro-Israel, so this was very wonderful to him. And then I said, and I love studying about the modern history of Israel. I said it that way. And he said, well, tell me about that. And so I began to give him this class. And we had a long flight. And so I did not sleep on that flight. I was fascinated by this conversation. So I'm telling him all this, and I get to the point of Czechoslovakia. And he goes, wait. So when I joined the IDF, Israeli Defense Forces, and they gave me a Czech rifle, now for the first time, I know what a Czech rifle is. I never knew. Why did they call it a Czech rifle? And now you explain it to me. That is fascinating. And by the way, that Jewish man showed me his scars that he suffered in the war. Anyway, Czechoslovakia agreed to ship them weapons. And they had no air force, you might know. And so the United States happened to be selling surplus military equipment. But they would not, there was a law against it. It could not be sent to Israel. So there were those private buyers of Army and Navy and Air Force surplus, who then flew them to various points around the world, then to Czechoslovakia, and then to Israel. And so Israel now is being supplied, and the idea was, of course, that they would pay for it. And Czechoslovakia supplied it, but they charged them, and they paid it all back. Eventually, Soviet Union, towards the end of it, said, stop, because they could see that Israel was not going to come into the arena of the satellite nations of the Soviet Union. So they put a stop to it. But that's one of the reasons. In fact, Israel attributes their winning to Czechoslovakia. And other interesting stories have come out of the history of Israel and their various wars. Many of you know, of course, the famous war of 1967, Six-Day War. That's important because the Six-Day War, where Israel had to face Egypt, Jordan, and Syria, which they defeated in 6 days, starting with a preemptive strike on the the Egypt Air Force, defeating the entire Air Force in 1 day. They took even more land in 1967. The Golan Heights, which is on the east side of the Sea of Galilee, the West Bank, which is the west bank of the Jordan River, and Gaza Strip, down along the Mediterranean Sea on the south. probably another 200 to 250,000 refugees were added to the refugee numbers out of the 1967 war. Today, these refugees camps are still very much there in those places I mentioned. Jordan. In Jordan, the Palestinian refugees are predominantly allowed to have passports, and they can become citizens of Jordan if they so choose. The Palestinian refugees in Syria and Lebanon are not allowed to have passports, are not considered citizens. And then you have refugees in the West Bank, which is controlled by Israel. The Palestinian Authority is primarily over the West Bank. And then you have Gaza, which is a number of years ago was run over. Israel gave it to the Palestinian Authority, which was then run over by Hamas, which is in the south. And so that's where many refugees are there in Gaza, many in the West Bank, and many of these other nations I just mentioned. Today, there's something like almost 3 million Palestinian refugees. They're registered by the United Nations, and they follow the line of the Father, the patrilineal line. So all of the refugees were registered at the end of those wars and can receive United Nations funds. I believe that the United Nations provides something close to $1 billion a year to refugees, the Palestinian refugees. And if the Palestinian refugees register and can demonstrate that their father was a Palestinian refugee, it continues generation after generation, and the numbers are increasing. Of course, that 700 and some thousand is now almost 3 million, and paid for by the United Nations that supplies many of their schools and healthcare and many provisions. So that is what we now come to, the modern history of the Palestinian problem. That is a summation, in short, of the entirety of that history. And that is about a thumbnail sketch as you can get. But we have recorded this because this is a lot of information, and it will be available on our YouTube channel. And so if you registered for the class, I will send a link to that YouTube a video for anyone who would like to see a copy or refer to this again. Now, I'm going to take questions in a few moments, and so be prepared to ask your question. And I'm going to be monitoring both live streams for questions, should any come into the live streams. But before I do that, I want to tell you of something of a personal nature and my commitment to Israel personally. I believe what I just said, of course, and I mean it personally. I love taking teams, groups to Israel. I do this regularly. And of course, the COVID whole thing put a hold on much of that. But we took a trip, what was that? A year ago fall, I think it was. And we had a group of 70, 71, and taking another group in April. And this is going to be a footsteps of Paul cruise, along with 2 days in Israel. And we have about 140 going on that trip. And so I tremendously enjoy taking groups. But more than that, I believe in this so much that I'm actually starting an organization. And this is the first I publicly announced it, because I'm in the process of developing a website, and hopefully it will be done this fall. It's done by a national organization. This is going to be a very large website. And the organization that I'm starting is called Blessers of Israel. And based upon that very theme, that those who bless Israel will be blessed. And there's several things that this organization hopes to accomplish. Number one, to start a rabbinical school in Israel demonstrating Jesus as the Jewish Messiah in Israel. And thank you very much. And I'm excited to do that. This will be taught by Jewish Messianic teachers using the Calvary Chapel approach of doing verse by verse, chapter by chapter, demonstrating Jesus as the Messiah through all of the old as well as the new, because they need to be able to speak of it and defend it all through the scriptures. And our intent is to equip Jewish messianic believers. When I say messianic, I mean they believe that Jesus is the Jewish Messiah, is the Messiah of Israel. They stand on that as Jesus, declaring boldly that Jesus is the Messiah. You might not know this, but there's actually a rising movement in Israel now, where Jews are beginning. It's a small movement beginning in Israel, where Jews are beginning to take hold of Jesus as the Messiah. And I intend to expand it greatly with rabbinical schools in Israel, supported by and prayed over by vast numbers of people here in the United States. This is going to be a national organization that I'm starting. And so rabbinical school in Israel. And we believe that we can train up Jews to speak of Jesus in the latter days. And so, you know, in the scriptures, it talks in the book of Revelation that there'll be 144,000 Jewish witnesses for Christ. I am excited about the possibility, maybe we're going to train some of those. I don't know about you, it just gets me excited thinking of that idea. Secondly, we are also going to provide what we call the signs of the times. In other words, Jesus said, watch for the signs of the times. If you're going to watch for the signs of the times, then you need to be aware of what's happening in the world regarding Israel and the events of the Middle East. So the intent is to provide news of what's happening in and around the events of Israel, connecting it to the scriptures and connecting it to prophecy of scriptures so that people can watch for the signs of the times and be aware of it through the lens of the scriptures. So that will be another major thing that we're going to do. And then, of course, we're going to equip and educate the church, as we are going to have speakers speaking in churches and at pastors' conferences in churches all over the country. And lastly, should there be a need politically to stand with Israel. Let's say, for example, that an administration decides to move the embassy from Jerusalem back to Tel Aviv, then our hope is that we would have a great voice in standing with Israel on an occasion such as that. That should be very limited in scope, because I do not believe this is a political organization. But if that voice is needed, then that voice will be used. That's the fourfold intent of the organization called Blessers of Israel. Hopefully we'll be announcing it to the church, giving the church opportunity to stand with us, sign, become members, become Blessers of Israel with us. So you'll be hearing more about that. Okay, now we're going to open it up for questions, and I have about 20 minutes. So I'm going to, now I also want to say this, those watching online, because of the nature of the technology, you are actually about a minute behind. So when you ask your question, I will see it, but it will be about a minute behind, and I'll answer it right away when I see it. Okay. That being said, let's go ahead. If we have any questions, I will repeat your question for the recording of it, and then I'll do my best to answer it. I don't know, of course, every answer, but I'll certainly do my best. So let's go ahead and start. Anyone have any questions? Always there are many. Okay, let's start right here in the middle.
Question for you. Didn't Israel obtain possession, for lack of better words, the Temple Mount in the 67?
He said, didn't Israel obtain the Temple Mount in the 67 war? Yes, they did. And so prior to that, Jews were expelled from Jerusalem, including the Jewish quarter. But in the 67 war, they overtook Jerusalem and the Temple Mount and the Western Wall. They decided for the wise choice of peace to allow Arab access to the Temple Mount. Now, on the Temple Mount is residing today the shrine, the Dome of the Shrine, which when you look at Israel and you see that golden domed building, that's the shrine. And so it is not a mosque, that is a shrine. There is a mosque next to it called the Al-Aqsa Mosque. And that was built in the 600s interestingly. So Israel decided to allow access. They control it. They control the security of it. So and they can shut it down at any time, which they have, should there be a security reason. They have agreed not to allow Jews to pray in the Temple Mount, that they can pray at the Western Wall. And so if a Jew does pray and visibly praying on the Temple Mount, they will be removed by the Jews. But that's a very, very good question. By the way, I did want to mention that in 1948, at that great war, the Jews call it the War of Independence. The Arabs call it al-Nakba, and it means in Arabic, the disaster. It is still referred to today as al-Nakba. 1948 war, al-Nakba, the disaster. So just wanted to throw that out there. But that was a very good question, and I appreciate you asking that one. That reminds me of the 73 Yom Kippur War. In the 1973, and I'll get to you next, okay? 1973 Yom Kippur War, again Israel was attacked on Yom Kippur. This caught them by surprise. And at first, the war went badly. Very badly for the Jews. They had to retreat. And it was looking like a disaster for Israel. Because this time the Arabs were far greater force, far more organized, and very well supplied. And it looked like a disaster. Finally, Golda Meir called the president of the United States asking for help. The president at the time was none other than Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon responded by calling his generals and saying, I want everything we have sent to Israel. Everything we have. Now, Richard Nixon's Secretary of State was Henry Kissinger. Henry Kissinger was a Jew. Henry Kissinger discouraged such a thing, even though he was a Jew. He discouraged such a thing, and he said, if you do that, the Soviets will enter this war. And then he said, then you tell them that if they enter this war, I will use nuclear weapons. And then Kissinger at one point said, if you send all of this, you will lose the support of many. You will lose the support of many in the United States. This was during Watergate. And he said, what are they going to do to me? He had already determined to resign. And so one of his last actions was to send everything. And the greatest transfer of arms, the greatest airlift of arms in the history of the world proceeded. And I believe that a shipment of arms landed something like, I don't know, every 30 seconds. We're talking about massive, massive, massive shipment of tanks and rifles and Air Force. In fact, the Air Force, the head of the Air Force called him and he said, President Nixon, you said you want everything. I'm not sure you're aware, but we have some extremely modern and sensitive high technology aircraft. Are you certain you want to send such to them? Nixon flew into a rage and cussed him out on the phone. And he said, I said you send everything, and I mean everything. And he hung up the phone. Golda Meir later said, if it wasn't for President Nixon, we would not have survived. She attributes the survival of the nation of Israel to Richard Nixon, who did so because his back was against the wall with Watergate and was planning to resign anyway. Now that is just an amazing move of nations and hearts. Absolutely fascinating. Okay, and I just took up 5 minutes of your questions. I apologize. Okay, we'll go here.
chance to help the Jewish people. When that happens, do it.
Mm.
And when Golda Meir calls him in the middle of the night, remember that. And he flew into action.
So just to repeat what you said the best that I can, she remembers reading about this story with Richard Nixon and his Quaker background. Was it his mother, you said, who told him, one day you will have an opportunity to help the Jews, and when you have that opportunity, help them. And Nixon remembered that. Okay, so her question was, the organization that I just mentioned, Blessed of Israel, does it have anything to do with CUFI? CUFI is an organization which stands for Christians United for Israel. And no, it has nothing to do with them. I know them very well. I know the leadership of CUFI. I've been to the summit meetings in Washington, D.C. With CUFI. No, their organization is primarily political. To organize people to stand with Israel politically, and which is one of the reasons why I do not believe that needs to be duplicated and will not be the primary impact of this organization. But that's an excellent question. Okay, over here, Paul. And then I'll go to you next.
You did mention, you touched on this earlier, but again, but for prophecy, and maybe only prophecy, your conjecture or thoughts on why more compassion, or, and I don't want to stereotype this by saying a younger generation, but I just did, having more compassion towards a Palestine movement or support or sympathy, any conjecture?
Yeah, so let me summarize your question. I think your question had to do with perhaps why does the younger generation vocalize such support for the Palestinian side of this thing? Is that kind of what your question is? Yeah. I believe several reasons. One is because of a lack of knowledge. And I believe that, they see it as the oppressor against the oppressed. And so the woke nature of the thing is to, stand with the oppressed here and, to stand with the Palestinian people who they feel are being oppressed because of this heavy hand of Israel over them. And that demonstrates, again, the lack of knowledge of the thing. Because if they can understand that the Palestinian goal here, the Palestinian Arab intent, is to destroy. They have no intent at peace. They have no intent of acknowledging the right of Israel to exist, even to this day. Their intent is to destroy. And so I remember hearing the Prime Minister of Israel now is Bennett. Before he was Prime Minister, I saw a tremendous interview he did on one of the major stations where they were asking him, quite confrontationally, when is this thing going to end? When will this conflict end? And I think he answered it beautifully when he said, I can tell you that in one answer, one simple answer. The day they stop trying to kill us is the day this thing will end. But they refuse to acknowledge our existence, our right to exist, and they are committed to our annihilation. There's you might hear this in the news. It's important to remember this phrase, from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. Something like this. I'm making a rhyme out of it, but from the river to the sea is the expression. Have you ever heard this? Remember it, because what they mean is from the River Jordan all the way to the Mediterranean. Well, that suggests the annihilation of the nation of Israel, and that's exactly what they're committed to. And interestingly, on one of my former trips to Israel, I had the opportunity to have, as a speaker to our group, a Palestinian Arab journalist, supporter of Israel. Okay, let me just frame him again. Palestinian Arab journalist, supporter of Israel. And he said, I live in Israel as a Palestinian Arab, or as an Arab, and I would rather live here in Israel than any Arab state that I know as an Arab, because I have freedom of religion. And I can criticize my leaders and not have to worry about being killed. And he said, and so he said, let me speak to the root cause and the answer. We're all ears. What's the root cause? The root cause is what happens in the home. Until that changes, this will never change. He said, let me give you an illustration. In the home of a Jew, every Sabbath, they have a Sabbath dinner. At the Sabbath dinner, the parents pray a blessing over their children. Every Sabbath. Now, I went to a home of a rabbi, and I had dinner on the Sabbath. And so I witnessed this very thing. I know exactly. Beautiful Jewish Sabbath dinner. After the meal, the parents will, one at a time, put their hands on the head of each child and pray a blessing over that child. And they'll pray God's hand to be on this child and God's blessing to be on this child. And they'll teach their children, you are a Jew. What that means is that God's favor is on you and God's blessing. You will arise one day. You'll be a wonderful man. You'll be a wonderful woman. You will be a doctor or a lawyer or a banker, or you'll be an engineer or some great thing. Pray for you right now. God's blessing. Next child. And then the mother will come follow, you know. He said that's what happens in the Jewish home. Now, in the Palestinian Arab home, in Palestinian territories, what happens in their homes is that the children are taught to hate the Jews, and that the greatest honor that Arab boy could ever have is to one day, if you could kill a Jew, that'll be the greatest honor. And if you could die a martyr, you'll even have the greatest honor of all while trying to kill a Jew. He said, now, let's see how are these boys going to end up. Until that changes in the home, this will never change. And so he said, there will never be peace until the Palestinian leaders start teaching their children, start teaching their families how to teach their children to believe for peace. Until that happens, there will never be peace. Okay, I forgot where we are. Okay, up here, I think.
About the religious belief among the Israelis, and in particular, the Jews that were there in the 19th century and before, the ultra-Orthodox.
So, okay.
It's my understanding that maybe 85% of the Israelis are not believers in God.
Okay, so let me repeat your question. You're speaking to, well, you spoke of some historical aspects of the Jewish belief and whether or not Jews today believe in God. Is that pretty close to your question? So Israel today is predominantly secular. So I would affirm what you're saying. Just looking to see if there was a question. Predominantly it is secular. That there are many who are Jews by, let's call it tradition. Not necessarily by belief. They do the Sabbath. They keep the Sabbath, interestingly. They don't use cell phones and things like this. But they don't do it out of belief necessarily. They do it out of tradition. So there's quite a few who do not believe in the Jewish law, the Jewish Torah, for example. But there are many still who do, the Orthodox Jews who do. And there's a rising movement of those who believe Jesus is the Messiah. And there are churches today in Israel who worship with celebration, just like we do here today. So there's an interesting development that's happening in Israel. So hopefully that answered your question, but it did bring me to another point, which is that when I spoke of Zionism, and the Zionist Congress. What is the definition of Zionism? It is the idea of a Jewish homeland for the Jewish people, that particularly in Israel. That's the idea. A Zionist is someone who believes in the establishment of a homeland for Israel. Now, there are many Jews today who are not Zionist. Now follow with me because this is an interesting nuance. There are many Jews today who are not Zionist. Here's why. They believe that the modern Israel government is secular, and therefore it is not the fulfillment, this is the Jewish thought, is not the fulfillment of the latter-day events spoken of prophetically, but rather it will be when the Messiah comes to establish his government that then it will be rightly established as that nation fulfilling the latter-day prophetic word. And perhaps those 2 points connect up together in your question. Okay, any other questions? Normally we run way over. But feel free to, and those watching at home, feel free also. Okay, here's one. Will you, with your new foundation, impact your prison leader outreach? Okay, this is a question. He knows my personal background. And many of you maybe know that I was part of the founding of a Bible college in Oregon State Penitentiary. Actually, not that particular one, but a penitentiary in Oregon. I was one of the founders of an organization to start a Bible college. And so the question has to do with, will it impact that ministry? In other words, will I have time to do both things? I have actually resigned from the prison university organization. I was part of the founding and establishing, and it went well, and I handed it off, and I'm ready to move on to Blessings of Israel. So that's a great question, but thank you for asking that question. Okay, anyone else have a question? All right, let me give you my email address, and then feel free, because there's normally a lot more questions, and perhaps you're being shy about it. But feel free to email me your question. I'll be happy to answer by email. And I love discussing this. It's deep in my heart. It's one of my great passions, and as you know, and so I would delight to answer your question. My email address is very easy. It's rich@calvaryhillsboro.org. How simple is that? And so you can ask a question anytime you would like. All right, that's going to wrap us up on time. First time ever. Unless anyone else has any further questions, we'll go ahead and close. Oh, okay, one over here. This is gonna be a 15-minute answer. Oh, no, Rich at Calvary, Hillsboro. Yeah, calvaryhillsboro.org. Paul.
Has the current administration suggested already or hinted at moving the embassy back?
His question was, has the current administration made any hints toward moving the embassy back? And I have not heard anything of that nature. I believe their hands are pretty full right now. But no, I have not heard. No, by the way, okay, thank you for asking the question, because it does bring up another point that I wanted to speak to, and I'll try to do this in less than a minute, because I have 1 minute left on my budgeted time. Afghanistan. What's happening in Afghanistan is relevant in this sense. I think that lessons are being learned that when given an opportunity, in other words, when there's a vacuum such as was occurring when the United States withdrawal happened so rapidly, that vacuum was instantly filled with terrorists. There is deep concern in Israel of such a thing happening in the Palestinian territories. They do not want the Palestinian Authority to be diminished in power, because they do not want a vacuum. If there is a vacuum of power in the Palestinian territories, it will be filled with terrorists. And so there is a effort today to strengthen. Israel is trying to strengthen the Palestinian Authority. In fact, I believe if you saw in the news, and this is, again, one of the reasons we want to be providing this news feed with interpretation to those who are become members of this organization, or could they become blessings of Israel with us. That is why, if you notice in the news, that the foreign minister met with the leader of the Abbas, the Palestinian leader, to find ways of strengthening them, to strengthen the Palestinian leadership, to have a partner for negotiations, but also so that they don't collapse and create a huge vacuum which will be filled immediately by terrorists and greater enemies on their side. Okay, there's so much more I could say, but now I'm 1 minute over my allotted time. Let's pray. Father, thank you so much for your heart after us. We see it demonstrated so powerfully in your steadfast commitment and faithful adherence to your promises to Israel. And it makes us have tremendous assurance that the promises that you give to us will never fail. Help us, Lord, to look with eyes at the events of the world, to see what's happening in light of Scripture, to be watching for signs of the time, to be on the alert. Help the church to be prepared. And God, if you could use us in any way to make that happen, God, then here we are. We are willing to be used of you. We honor you and thank you for it all. In Jesus' name. And everyone said, let's give the Lord